Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy, with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun.
Kia ora katoa, as Bernard would say. Bernard is in Dubai, or at least leaving Dubai right now on the way to New Zealand. I hope that's not, too revealing security information. So I'm going to be doing this myself today. Bernard wishes he could do it, but he's not got adequate Wi-Fi and he's on his way. Got 14 hours or so. We'll probably see him tomorrow, I imagine. We're going to, because of that, and a little bit as we did last week, and the last 2 weeks, in fact, we're going to extend the international section of the show. There's been some quite interesting international developments, as you know, the last 10 days or so, and the last week, and the last couple of weeks, and we're going to focus again on Iran, Israel, and the US president, and various other things, and we've got a wonderful group of people to be doing that. Then Bernard will be back next week, and we'll again split it much more between the housing market with bits tacked on and whatever's going on in the world. With the Iran-Israel story, we have two professors, one of which you know very well, one of which you've met previously, Tricia Dunworth from Auckland, because we want to look at the diplomacy aspects. We want to look at the international law aspects, and also, of course, what this means for the way Robert Patman in particular sees New Zealand diplomacy and how New Zealand diplomacy works. And of course, Robert often speaks about the need for a rules-based system, and we've seen that kind of rather blown apart almost literally this week. And again, and I'll explain why I brought him on again. We've got Jonathan Lyons, who, as I mentioned last week, is an old colleague of mine from Reuters, who's written multiple books about Iran and the Islamic world, and is a really deep thinker. I loved the way he described going back 1,000 years when I asked him a question about how to think about Iraq. And the reason I wanted to bring him in again is we need to think, I think, about the Iranian history, the shame that the Iranian regime is being subjected to at the moment, or the Iranian people. And Jonathan also asked me, and we'll deal with it at the end of it, wanted to talk about an assertion he wants to make about terrorism and how we talk about terrorism and terror. And I think that will be really interesting, particularly with Tricia Dunworth on, an international law professor, and Robert. So I think the international section, I'm hoping, will be expansive. And as you know from the backdrop, it's not going to be expensive. We've got Catherine Dyer on shortly to discuss the latest in climate news and give us a perspective on targets, direction, and I may even have extracted a good news story from her, not that there's much good news out there. And at the end, I've come up with a, not exactly an X-rated, but a slightly naughty skateboarding dog, given what's been going on. And I've been meaning to do this for weeks. I'm just going to take the liberty to say I've been meaning to recommend a book to you all. And it is Evan Osnos from The New Yorker has written a book called The Haves and the Have-Yots, Dispatches from the Ultra-Rich. And the thing, one of the reasons I'm mentioning it is that it has a couple of really good chapters that refer to New Zealand. One is about the Peter Thiel types who are getting residency here, and those people building, looking for a bolt hole, and also building hideaways and that kind of thing. It also has a lot about super yachts, and it's quite timely to talk about super yachts when Jeff Bezos and Laura Sanchez are in Venice for their wedding with a few hundred of their closest friends, and were pictured having a foam party on their super yacht, Koru. Now, Koru, yes, it is a Maori name, is 3/4 the length of a Cook Strait ferry. It's only the 33rd longest super yacht in the world, but it has a New Zealand angle in that its three immense masts were built at Avondale at Southern Spars, and it cost around $500 million. And so that you don't have to, I looked at the New York Post page 6 today about their frolicking and saw the 55-year-old Ms. Sanchez and the 61-year-old Jeff Bezos having what was called PDA, which then meant that I had to look it up, public displays of affection, including spanking. So that's enough tabloid stuff. Catherine, it's really good to see you. Let's now that we've talked about Jeff Bezos, I mean, it's pretty funny actually to see the people of Venice objecting to it so much, but it's lovely to see you. We've talked about super yachts. We talk about a support yacht, which is as big as the other yacht. Over to you. What do you want to talk about today? What's your climate today?
Kia ora. Nice to see you, Peter, and everybody else. What I thought we might want to talk about today is the heat waves that are going on. So simultaneously, they've got this massive heat wave across the US that's been affecting 150 million people, and in Europe as well. And we saw Bernard sweating a little bit last week on the Hoon in France. So
I think it was 34 in NLC, wasn't it, that he was saying? Yeah, which is pretty hot.
It's pretty warm, yeah. So what they're saying is that, first of all, that heat waves in general are more common, more intense and longer lasting than they would have been without climate change. But also
who's
in the latest...
saying that, Catherine? One of the things that was interesting in that note that you sent me, who is saying that?
So that came from a researcher called... I've got her name written down here. She is an expert in weather attribution. So she attributes weather to climate change. So that's her area of research. I'll have to dig her name out of the article in a minute. Frederica Otto. Her name is.
Yes. Based out, I know. Yeah.
Yep. And so that came from her. She was also talking about the fact that that these heat waves are up to 7 degrees Celsius hotter than they would have been without climate change or without burning fossil fuels. So in most parts of the world, so that excludes the tropics, but it includes areas like the US and Europe and UK. So 7 degrees C hotter in the midst of those heat waves than they would have been otherwise. And the UK heat wave that they've just experienced, the attribution for that was that it was 100 times more likely compared to the pre-industrial period. So there was also some quotes in that article that I sent you from Professor Michael Mann, a climate scientist in the US, and basically pointing out that the climate models have severely underestimated this type of heat waves in general.
So there's the general rise in climate, and then there's the exaggeration of the high points. Yeah.
But even things like the climate domes, where you get persistent hot weather underneath the domes, which is what's happening in the US at the moment, the climate models don't do a very good job of predicting those. And so what we've seen lately is heat wave extremes that have been much more extreme than what was anticipated, that what was projected and forecast in the models. And they're also saying that as the temperature gets higher, and that's happening much faster than the models are predicting as well, like the average temperature is getting higher, so we can expect these kinds of events to be much more severe than what has been predicted. So what people have been expecting, it's going to be a lot worse than that.
I noticed today also there's some spectacular footage of flooding in China with super intense, rivers collapsing and so, or the banks of rivers collapsing and so on. It also interested me, Catherine, that the way the link you sent me was to a story on AccuWeather. Given that AccuWeather is owned, I believe, by a friend of Donald Trump's and is expected to play a really significant role in taking over from the sort of American state meteorologists.
Yeah, and so there's the risks as well, where you start to see, the information about this sort of thing starting to not get out as well as it has done previously. So there is becoming, I think, a higher rate of interference in funding the studies and the satellites and all of that sort of thing that give us that information in the first place, and then not communicating it when when it happens. So there's a lot of risk of mis and disinformation in there as well as we go forward.
Yeah, and so what's your thinking about how we think about heat waves? Because I was also struck, Catherine. And again, we talk about this quite regularly about the way these things are reported. Joe Rogan had somebody on the other day and was talking about that Washington Post longitudinal study which showed we're in a cooling phase, but it's in a cooling phase relative to many centuries, but.
I mean, have they been outside lately? I mean, I know that's talking about weather rather than climate, so I'm kind of falling into a bit of a trap there. But, I think most people with more than a couple of brain cells to rub together have figured out that climate change is real and it is actually happening because we're experiencing it more and more in our everyday lives. So, that was
what that story really just that story was partly about adaptation. We're just not adapted. We're not ready for those kinds of the increased intensity and frequency of those kind of events.
Yeah, there was actually an article in the Guardian this week, and they were talking to a climate communication specialist called Genevieve Gunther. And she was looking about how we talk about and communicate climate change, and she was saying that we actually are not talking enough about the nature of the catastrophic risks in front of us, and that people are often, there's been a lot of a backlash against talking frankly about some of those threats and insisting on more positive language and positive stories. But what that can do is make people become more complacent.
Yeah.
And so, and it's alongside of those kind of risks that we talk about, it is also important to kind of start to talk about what people can do and what communities can do about it, and that's an important element of it as well.
Yeah, I was surprised in a way to see. Sorry, Catherine, to see when you say communities, there's this thing coming up from, again, I keep talking about. Although hopefully I won't use my slippery bar of soap analogy for David Seymour this time, but talking about councils not caring about the climate and not having climate policies, but fixing the roads, and that all sounds very logical. But I recall when Michael Bloomberg organised a kind of when he was the mayor of New York, a big city effort with London, New York, and Sao Paulo and various other places to address this, because cities are both the consequences of climate change are going to be immense in the cities, but they're also gigantic generators of carbon.
Yeah, the problem with that kind of common sense thing of, we should be focusing on the roads, is that all makes sense until a catastrophic event happened yesterday. And then it doesn't make sense anymore to have focused on potholes.
That's right.
In the face of, the sort of things that might come out of that. So, it's all very well to say those things and to say it's common sense, but it only starts to make common sense to prepare for these events in the aftermath of them. And of course, it's too late by then. So it is, we're also seeing a lot of red flags around the world of central governments, for instance, starting to pull back from dealing with the massive costs associated with, climate risks and so on. So using the US as an example, up until 2016, the federal government in the US paid about a third of the costs associated with climate events. Mm-hmm. And since then, that number has shrunk to 2%.
Yeah.
And it's still going down. Sorry. So what that means is the risks and the costs have been, if they're not being managed by central governments, then they fall more directly on local communities, and they are left to themselves to figure out how to deal with it.
Which is exactly what this whole reduction in the capacity of FEMA is all about as well in the US. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you see markets withdrawing as well. So you see insurance companies going, the risks are too high now. I can't make a guaranteed profit, so I'm going to pull out of that market altogether. And that leaves, local communities and households on their own to deal with the consequences of whatever happens.
I was struck also, we wanted to talk about New Zealand pulling out of an international coalition called Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which clearly was a legacy from when we had stopped doing offshore oil and gas exploration, and now we've started it. So there's a certain logic to that, I guess, but it's just another signal that we're not committed to what we were 3 years ago, correct?
Yeah, so what I understand, like this Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance was a venture that we signed up to during the Glasgow COP in 2021, and it was with other countries, including it was led by Denmark and Costa Rica, but also France, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and several Pacific Island countries were involved in it. And what I understand happened is that since the New Zealand government decided we're going to repeal the ban on oil and gas exploration, and then in the latest budget added $200 million of government investment funds into oil and gas exploration, some of those other countries were starting to murmur about the fact that we'd signed up to this goal and this alliance with them, and we're doing the exact opposite. And so the Minister for Climate Change, Simon Watts, very quietly in the background pulled out of it in June. Mm-hmm. And the only people that noticed were Carbon Brief. So there was a report on it in really? Carbon Brief, and then that got picked up by RNZ, by Eloise Gibson. Mm-hmm. So there were no announcements, no PR, no, hoping, I think, that nobody would notice. And of course, a lot of people are, and increasingly numbers of our trade partners are noticing. Yes. One of the things that one of the Green Party MPs brought up is that we're in a free trade agreement with one of those countries, Costa Rica, but also Switzerland and Iceland. And we are now legally in breach of that free trade agreement.
Was being part of that agreement was part of the trade agreement, part of being in that pact.
Well, the things that we've stopped doing and investing in oil and gas exploration and so on are in contravention of the terms of that trade agreement. And so, those now we might not export a hell of a lot to those particular set of countries, but that's kind of the tip of the iceberg, and we know that they're aware because there were these murmurings going on in this other, arrangement, the Beyond Oil and Gas thing. There's crossover there. So, yeah, it's worrying that it's it's a really bad look. Yeah. It's a bad look, and it's getting noticed, and it's increasingly getting noticed.
And Catherine, you've been involved in a workshop this week, which sounds really interesting, including from this aspect of how we feed this information to the public and how the public learns about it and distinguishes between misinformation, disinformation, and information that this needs to be corrected, or the best that we know at the moment. It's this critical science workshop. Tell us about that.
So it's actually an event that hasn't started yet. It's opening on 18th of July and it will run through to the end of September. It's called Critical Signals, and it is a community-led approach to dealing with rapid change. So we're looking at how do communities prepare for rapid change, and within that space, we're going to have artists. So we'll have artist installations, activists, and academics. So we'll be running workshops and seminars across that period. And the public, this is relevant for local Wellingtonians. It's going to be at 115 Taranaki Street in Te Aro, Wellington, and will run for a couple of months. So people should come on down. I'll be doing a seminar. We'll have other people doing seminars during the process, and we'll also be doing some research while we're there.
Brilliant. Well, let's do a Hoon from there as well. I mean, if we're doing these international news ones where we expand that when Bernard's away, let's do one we expand the climate part.
That'd be fantastic.
So let me segue from there, Catherine, to the and let me say, Robert, I think when you came in, there's a little bit of an echo. Is it possible that you've got your speakers on your computer? Thank you, Catherine. Thanks, Catherine Dyer.
Can you hear me okay now?
I can hear you okay now. There is a little bit of an echo.
Is there? Oh.
Yeah. Might go when Catherine goes. Jonathan, good to see you. I'll just introduce you formally in a second, but because the echo came in initially when... Yeah. Hello, Tricia, how are you?
Good, thank you.
All right, we've got a little bit... Simon, can you manage that echo? Right, can everybody make sure that their speakers aren't turned on as well as their headphones?
Do I have an echo?
Off in the... Yeah, okay, let's go. So let me just do it. This is Simon... Simon will edit all this and make it.
Hear anything now?
Okay. So let me welcome three people familiar to listeners and watchers of the Hoon. We've got Professor Robert Patman, who's on very regularly, and I was just about to try and repronounce again sesquicentennial distinguished chairs from Otago.
Conversation stopper.
Yeah, it is. Sesquicentennial is quite tricky. And Tricia Dunworth, and thanks to Professor Tricia Dunworth, a professor of international law at Auckland University, and thanks to one of our listeners who took me to task, I now realise that it's Tricia. So
No,
we're all.
I still haven't got it right.
Oh,
I did mean to text you today. So
Yeah,
here it
tell
is.
me.
Here's the lesson. Trasa.
Trasa. Teresa. Okay, good, excellent. And we've got Jonathan Lyons, a former colleague of mine from Reuters, author, historian, and deep thinker on all matters Iran and Islam. And I was saying to people before you came on, Jonathan, that your 1,000-year perspective, if not your 1,000-yard stare, were just perfect when you came on. So I thought it would be really interesting to bring you back on. And I'm going to ask Tricia, last time when we had three people, I'm going to ask each one of you to just talk a little bit about a particular aspect of all this, and we're going to start with Jonathan, then go to Robert, and then come to you, please, Tricia. Jonathan, I want to look at what you think these attacks and the ceasefire, the US intervention. We talked a lot last time you were here last week about Iran and its history, the 1979 revolution and the hostage crisis and so on. What do you think this state of affairs at the moment means for Iran and the future of the current administration there?
For the Iranian administration?
Yes, for the Iranian. Yeah.
I think a lot of it depends on what's actually happened, and we don't really know. Mission accomplished, it occurs to me, is a win for everybody. You know, it's a win for the Israelis. They did what they said they would do. It's a win for Trump, who's had a military triumph and is now hemmed in Netanyahu, who can't attack again to destroy a system that is already destroyed. Mm-hmm. And it's a win for the Iranians, assuming it isn't actually destroyed, because now their parliament wants to kick out the IEA. So no third party will go in and tell us what's going on. And so they can just quietly go about doing whatever it is they were quietly doing before. I did notice in the press that apparently Ali Khamenei has not been seen in public. I sense, and again, I'm not connected to Iran the way I used to be, that it's just a precaution, security precaution under very uncertain times. And apparently he's not taking any electronic media with him, and he's probably only meeting through very trusted emissaries. We do know that he named 3 potential successors during the height of the attacks. And interestingly, his son was not one of them. So I think that dodged a little bit of a bullet. We don't have the names of the people he did name. What I think it means, I think they will try to harness this nationalism that's been released, that should be no surprise to anyone who knows anything about Iran and its long history and its nationhood. They could harness it in a number of ways. They could harness it. I see the president is talking about harnessing it as a way to take another step towards reform, that he can rally the nation around the flag. So I think that that's one thing we may see is a new opening.
A new opening for diplomacy, or a new opening to?
Well, I think we may see a new opening in domestic politics in Iran. Diplomacy is tough. I mean, the Americans were supposed to meet the Iranians. The bombs went off. The Americans have pulled out of deals that Trump himself pulled out before. It would be hard to have a lot of trust there, even if we didn't have 40 years of history or 50 years of history behind us. But I don't want to hijack your question or your program.
Not at all.
But it occurs to me that no one's asking the question is, who really needs these nukes? And what would, it occurs to me if Iran announced tomorrow, hey, we've actually done it, what happens? Well, Israel then says, well, we've got one too. And so now Israel and Iran can pretend to be the US and the Soviets during the Cold War. We can have mutually assured destruction in the Middle East, and nothing will change. So when we talked last week about the demonization of Iran, I guess the question I should have asked is, what's the basis of that demonization if the weapon itself is not actually useful? It's never been used since 1945. It's hard to see it being used in the contemporary context. It is a defensive measure for the most part.
I guess the way Iran gets framed, though, in that, Jonathan, is that it's a millenarian kind of death cult, and that if your objective is to destroy Israel, you could go with it. That it is just there's an oblivion aspect there, or we get led to believe that there's an oblivion aspect, maybe even in Shiism.
I would deeply dispute that there is such a thing. It may, in fact, be the discourse that we are forced to live with. It is not a suicidal regime. It is not a suicidal cult. It is. They have done a brilliant job, if you ask me, to give the Iranians their due, for surviving in a very hostile environment for many, many decades in a system that very few people would accept or see as viable. So we have to take our hats off to their survivability, if nothing else. So,
and Jonathan,
one last
thing on the. I'm sorry. Forgive me.
I say it's early to count them out in any way.
Yeah. And I was thinking about when you were there as well, and also going back a lot further. I mean, I read something very interesting the other day about Kissinger and the Shah talking about a nuclear energy program that the Shah wanted, and Kissinger had achieved some kind of thing about uranium enrichment even then. Is this just some sort of national pride thing that a country that big feels it needs that one? And what's the legacy of that? And was this running on when you were there? And then I'll come to Robert after you've answered.
It wasn't active when I was there, but I should say that yes, historically this has been a marker. It was a marker for many developing countries of that they've arrived on the world stage. And the Shah was very much interested, and Kissinger was very cautious to try to keep the genie inside the bottle. So it's a long-standing national project that has transcended the regime change from a British-supported monarchy to a Shia theology, a radical theological system that, as I said last week, is really outside the pale of traditional Shia thought, but survives nonetheless.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's also very interesting to think about Pakistan's role in this, with A.Q. Khan having essentially, who was it's worth looking, and we might not go too deep into A.Q. Khan, but it's kind of interesting because, of course, that's how Pakistan got the bomb, and he leaked the necessary bits and pieces out to Iran as well. It's very interesting, that connection, I think, between two neighbors and, as you say, two emerging countries. Robert, we talked a little bit about two countries who don't give a fuck today. What's this doing to diplomacy, to your sense of rules-based order? It's been quite a, Jonathan did say, essentially sort of gave Trump a little bit of a fillip there. Maybe he's achieved something here, or is it just full of risks as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think Jonathan's absolutely right. In the short term, all parties can claim, with this fragile ceasefire in place, all parties can claim some sort of victory. I think the difference, however, will be in the medium to long term. And I actually think Iran may come out of it better than the other two, because both the United States and Israel operated on the engineering assumption that they could obliterate and eliminate Iran's nuclear capability, which in our previous discussions, many of us were very, very skeptical of. And I don't think that will be achieved, and the US intelligence already suggests, much to Mr. Trump's fury, that
I think but the use of bunker
he's
got
bombs,
other facts. Yeah.
Sorry? Oh,
he's
yes,
got
I know.
other facts. Yeah.
But I think the other factor here, which you touched on, so that's one thing. I think the time factor will redistribute who's won. In the short term, they can all claim something. A second factor here is, I think Mark Rutte, never quite sure how to pronounce his name. I think it's Rutte. The
got to be careful
Secretary
with that in
General
New Zealand,
of NATO,
yeah.
I think, has really made a disastrous error of judgment. I'm not just talking about his sort of slobbering fawning over Mr. Trump.
Yeah, I described
I'm
it as a
talking
blowjob,
about
but that might
the
be
fact that he said that use of that attack by the US was consistent with international law. And now Mr. Putin must be really enjoyed those comments, because part of the rationale for opposing Putin's invasion of Ukraine is because it is, if you like, ripping up the UN Charter and destroying the doctrine of inviolability of state, territorial inviolability of state, and respect for state sovereignty. I think, once again, members of NATO's attempt to be on good terms with Mr. Trump has meant they've compromised something which up to now they've held quite seriously, which I think is a major strategic error of judgment. And I think it certainly won't make international support for Ukraine any easier. But let's see what happens.
Well, we'll come back to that, Robert, because we'll get from the three. I'll just go to Tresha, because you were in danger of creeping into being not only the armchair war professor but the armchair international law professor. Tresha, what does this mean for international law? I mean, we hear that the Israeli attack was preemptive and therefore against international law. The Iranian response was a response. Then there's the attack on Qatar, and then there's the American attack, or perhaps, sorry, I'm getting the wrong order, the American attack on Iran, and then where does this leave us all with international law and whether it even exists or matters, or are we just entering into a might is right phase?
Well, I mean, it's not good. I think that the first thing to say is that the first attack by Israel, as a matter of pure international law, and I agree that it's also strategically foolish, is no credible international lawyer thinks that was a lawful attack. So it drove, that was a real problem in terms of hollowing out the rule against, yes, state sovereignty, but also the prohibition on the use of force. So that is a concern, but Iran's language was also about retaliation. So there isn't retaliation, there's a right to act in self-defense. So Iran arguably had a right to act in self-defense, but its behavior and its statements made it also responsible. I don't think that their actions came under self-defense. And then the United States, it's farcical to think that the United States were under an active and immediate threat from Iran. So as far as I'm concerned, none of them acted within the law. What does that mean for international law? We see, this isn't the first time that we have seen international law totally disregarded. Russia and the Ukraine are a classic example. And I guess international law is a language. If we didn't have it, I mean, one of the things I like to constantly say is that we don't say, oh, people drink and then drive, or oh, people run red lights, or oh, people break the speed limit, or oh, people, assault each other. So let's get rid of the criminal law. We don't say that.
No, right? but so okay. So Robert called into question the NATO reaction. We've had the Keir Starmer reaction. I thought the New Zealand reaction to this was actually quite wise in a way, of saying we're going to wait and see, because they didn't want to, they wanted to be very cautious about this. Tricia, where does this leave us? Are we just in might is right? Fuck you territory, as Trump may say, and sort of more or less did today?
I don't think we're in a might is right. I think we're in might is overwhelming, and we all turn our gaze there, and not we're squandering our opportunities to think more broadly about these things. And maybe it needs I kept saying that about Gaza, and maybe it needs to get that bad for people to realize that we need a different way of managing these things. But look, we haven't. might isn't right, and we must keep banging on about that this isn't either a politically good strategy, a morally good strategy, and it's an unlawful strategy. Whose interests is it serving? I mean, Jonathan rightly says, well, even if Iran did have one nuclear weapon, the United States has thousands, and Israel it's widely accepted that Israel has somewhere between 90 and 100. Maybe others would know better details than that. I think that there's two big regrets from a legal point of view. One is this slide into the language of retaliation. We have a right to retaliate.
You have a right to, but also you have, so Israel has a right to, and of course there is we have oddly, and really only one person who pushes this, but I sort of agree with them in some respects that, Israel has that sense of existential threat, and has, over 70 years conducted extraordinary, brave, courageous, and sometimes preemptive, and sometimes presumably illegal acts in order to defend itself from what it perceives to be that existential threat.
Yes, that's right.
There is a question in there somewhere.
That is right. There's an expression among lawyers which it says, hard cases make bad law. Right? So we shouldn't look to Israel for the defining kind of contours of international legality or international law. But you see, if we turn the tables in terms of the Russian-Ukraine situation, Russia's feels itself under threat, like over several decades, certainly since the end of the Cold War, where NATO is getting more and more robust and, gobbling up the states, coming ever closer to the boundaries of the Russian Federation. So they probably felt that they were under an existential threat as well.
Yeah, or they can certainly play that game. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, Robert, what you feel about that because you're so strong on this idea of New Zealand potentially having, or New Zealand being and smaller countries like New Zealand being more effective if they band together. What does this sort of outcome lead you to think?
Well, I'm not confident that liberal democracies at the moment, and this is not just small liberal democracies like relatively small liberal democracies like New Zealand, or middle powers. Canada, for example, or Scandinavian countries, I don't see much sense of leadership. Europe is still, I think, intellectually and emotionally dependent on US leadership. And that's come through. I thought there was going to be a change with the German leader, Friedrich Merz, but I'm not sure. But, to be fair to the Secretary General, who I just criticised, of NATO, some people have said he's doing what's necessary in order to get NATO countries to get up to 5%, which will then give them much more independence in terms of their strategy towards backing Ukraine. But that's all pretty long term. I would like to see countries which do depend on rules and procedures in their foreign policy be a little bit more assertive in defense of their interests. I think that's really important. The world is confronted by problems that no one can fix on their own. So by definition, smaller countries and middle powers have some leverage, but they do need to have some political courage to exercise it. And with the exception of Spain and Ireland, I haven't seen too much coming out of Europe. I've been disappointed by the fact that our government seems to believe that wait and see approach for crucial moral international issues is some sort of substitute for policy. It's not. And it makes us look pretty weak, to say the least. I think the rest of the world, I appreciate that New Zealand's a relatively small player, but it has been regarded as something of a good international citizen. I'm not sure it's living up to that at the moment. And I think, we live in an interconnected world. New Zealanders are often surprised by how much other people notice when we do good things, but they also notice when we drop the ball.
Yeah.
And I think at the moment, this wait and see approach, sitting on the fence, I'm not convinced it's wise. I don't mean that we have to react to everything that's going on, but I do think we have to give some sort of intellectual coherence, which is consistent with our national interests. So I'm a bit concerned there.
Jonathan, I'm going to come to you in a moment. Oh, sorry, Tricia, you
I was
you
just going
wanted to
say
respond.
to
No,
Robert,
forgive me.
I do agree. It would be nice to see our government sort of showing a little bit more leadership. But I do think that this is an improvement. The reaction to these last few days has been an improvement to what we've had to the Gaza war all these months. I do think it's getting better.
All right. So I was
Yeah.
so let me. I want to go to. I want to come back to Gaza if you don't mind, because I you know, it is. But Jonathan, I wanted to ask you about. There's been talk both about whether this could clear the way for Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords, and then Trump has been kind of talking about even Iran joining some sort of equivalent. I mean, that would be an amazing sort of outcome. And we haven't got Anthony Lowenstein on, but he completely disagrees with my view that the Abraham Accords, much against my expectations and sense of where they'd come from, appear to have had some effect and been beneficial, and possibly even being beneficial at the moment, with Saudi Arabia declining to join them until there is a clear view on a Palestinian state. Jonathan, what do you think about that sort of, and then we'll talk about Gaza, that chemistry of that Trump is creating in the region?
I think that we go back far enough, and we don't have to go back 1,000 years this time, but we go back far enough and we'll see that, in fact, there was a time when Israel's interests and Iran's interests and the U.S. interests coincided, a Venn diagram, and keep the Arabs in line and
do you
keep
mean
the
Iran
oil
Contra?
flowing. Yeah.
Do you mean at the time of Iran-Contra?
No, but under the Shah. Under the Shah. Keep the oil flowing was, but again, I don't really study international relations, and I don't really engage in political speculation, to be honest.
However,
I think, well, no, however, I want to answer a different question.
yeah.
I came to the conclusion last night when I was thinking about this appearance that, in fact, the whole nuclear thing is what the writers would call a MacGuffin.
Mm-hmm.
This is not about nukes. I really don't believe the attacks had anything to do with nuclear weapons.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Iran was deeply weakened by the fall of the explosion with Hamas, the fall of Hezbollah, the fall of Syria. The Houthis are off doing their thing, and the Shia of Iraq have had enough of Iranian meddling, and so they're very weak in their forward axis of resistance.
Yep.
Israel and Iran are the two mega powers in the Middle East when it comes to weaponry, economics, and clout. The Israelis saw a chance to hit their rival when he or she was down. The nukes were the perfect cover. I don't think this was about nukes at all.
No, I think
because
that's a
the
really
nukes really are
interesting
useless.
perspective. Yeah.
If you take the nukes out of the, then you say it's just traditional geopolitics, which is a roundabout way of answering your question, I think.
No, but it is. It's a really interesting perspective, Jonathan, to think. I mean, I have read about this, of course, that there was a moment when, having destroyed Hezbollah, and then with the fall of Bashar al-Assad opening up that corridor of attack, it opened up an opportunity. And then you're saying that the nukes were just the excuse.
So let's go further. Egypt disappeared from. Egypt and Syria were the two militant powers in the 50s and 60s in the Arab world. They're both off the table now. The Gulf Arabs are out making money. They're off the table. So we really have Iran and Israel. And to me, the conditions were right for something that Netanyahu and his allies always wanted to do, which was take out the Iranian military threat. And the nukes were like the excuse.
So do you see the possibility of positive outcomes to this in terms of, or are we going to have a sort of bipolar, in every respect of that word, bipolar Middle East?
Well, we know that before these attacks, the Iranians and the Gulf Arabs were moving closer together. And so we can see there's potential. They recognize they have interests in a stable region. Israel's kind of the odd person out at the moment. Makes it difficult to really say what they're after. But I think that there's no good reason. I mean, Iran is a nation state, as I said last week, with its own interests, and will pursue them. And those interests could coincide with the interests of Gulf Arabs, and could even coincide with a peaceful resolution to some of these issues. But Palestine, Gaza, Israel, these are very significant hurdles that I don't personally see being overcome. But I don't see it as a absolute given that we have to be in a polarized world. But improvement, not from this. I don't think this is helping.
Well, you're doing an elegant segue then about to Gaza then. If we do Gaza, and if we take Gaza as a specific issue at the moment, and then also how that backs into the idea of a two-state solution, which is New Zealand policy theoretically, and theoretically American policy, although I consider that to be fast changing as we see what Huckabee and people say out loud. Jonathan, you think it's still, I mean, is there a way in fact that settling this to some extent could increase pressure on Israel to agree to a Palestinian state, a Palestinian future?
Well, if we go with the fiction that the nuke problem is solved, which is the current fiction shared by all parties, then we can say, of course, we can try to bring Israel and the Gulf Arabs into understanding, and the Gulf Arabs have been adamant. There has to be a Palestinian solution, and it has to be a Palestinian state. And so you would expect that Israel
really
would
only
have
the
to
Saudis,
concede.
right? I mean, the Saudis are the ones who are holding that up. I mean, the Moroccans, Sudan, and the UAE and Qatar agreed, correct? And Bahrain. Is Qatar in the Abraham Accords? I don't think it is. I think it's Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, and Sudan. So
Right, but
really,
what I'm saying is to get Israel into the party, they're going to have to make concessions to the one issue that the Arab world, for the most part, can actually agree upon, and that is the solution to the Palestinian issue. And then if they can take the nukes out, then they can do it.
Yeah. Tricia, what do you how would you react to that? That's such an interesting idea in a way that, to remake the world. But Gaza has been going on this week with 40 or 50 people killed every day. I noticed there were, I think, seven Israeli soldiers killed yesterday, taking the total of Israeli soldiers to, I think, 839 or something like that, nearly 1,000. And of course, there are 55,000 civilians being killed. Gaza just sits up there being...
I have a question. I'd really like to hear what Jonathan has to say. Is that it seemed to me before the attack, as we were in the days leading up to the attack on Iran, that the tide was shifting, or public opinion, or even government opinion. Israel was under more and more pressure about its behavior and its policies in Gaza. And is it what are your thoughts about those who say that this was a deliberate strategy of Netanyahu to kind of look over there?
Yeah.
It seems reasonable because that's exactly, it achieved that goal. And it's always difficult to take a result and then try to go back to the motivation from it, but he certainly achieved that. And maybe this obliteration decision will put Gaza back in the front and center where it belongs.
You mean that we just all accept that it is obliterated, whether it is or not?
I see that.
I mean, because Gaza is certainly obliterated.
I think that the other thing is we can sit here talking like we're dealing with rational actors, and that's always been a major flaw in deterrence theory, right? It was like, we've got some states that are reliable and safe, and they'll make rational, calm decisions about the use of these catastrophic weapons, but we mustn't let rogue states.
Exactly. Tricia, that's an excellent segue into the statement that you're the organisation that I think you're on the board of, or the chairman of the board of the trustees for an organisation called the Disarmament and Security Centre, which you put out a really good thing of this week, really interesting and thoughtful statement about diplomacy and the importance of diplomacy. But one of the things that you, and this is going to be part of my segue back again to Jonathan about a word that he wants us to discuss. You, or the Disarmament and Security Center, talked about the dangerous dehumanization of Iranians, Palestinians, or Israelis, and that people are not their governments. Fear-driven narratives fuel war. We must instead rely on facts, international law, and historical lessons to guide us forward. And that's almost exactly why I asked Jonathan to come on last week, having not talked to him for probably 20 years, because we need this understanding, and also this, no one, very few people would read as much, normal humans would read as much of this as I do as well. And it is hard not to see that the Iranians, certainly the administration, is demonized, and also that Islamic countries, but Islam-run countries, are seen as millenarian death cults, really. I mean, that's what we came to with ISIS, certainly, which may have been. But would you just answer that first, partly because it was your organization that made that statement?
Yeah, so our point there really was, it's really important. Like, I've written about the sanctions against Russia, and I'm concerned that those sanctions are so extensive that they're actually punishing Russian people. But our problem isn't with Russian people. They don't, particularly in autocratic states, they're not responsible for their government's actions. Even in democratic states, we're not responsible for the New Zealand government. So I think, without wanting to go all kumbaya on it, I think that if we could strip away the shells of the rational state and look to the human beings and have ways of, well, certainly not be dehumanizing, and to think more broadly about these things, because the alternative is this saturation in military spending, in destruction, in the weapons manufacturers making money on it, war profiteering. People say if we're anti-militaristic, that you're naive and you're utopian. But I would say that isn't it naive to think that bombing Iran is going to make anything better?
It looks good in the moment. Robert, would you like to come in and discuss this? Because I really liked the way Jonathan put this last week, and I'm going to use this as I want to ask a couple of questions. I want to ask Teresa in a minute about the JCPOA, and then one more on NATO, and then I want to give some space for Jonathan to talk about terrorism with your input. Robert, please go ahead.
I think Jonathan nailed it when he said that this was not just about the Israeli attack on Iran was not just about nuclear weapons. And the reason this is important, I think, to get to the bottom of, is because it's all about regime change. Their attacks were not confined to nuclear facilities. And why is that important? Because there's a strategic linkage between the Gaza issue and the attacks on Iran. And this comes back, following on from what Jonathan has said. Mr. Netanyahu has been in denial for 3 decades about the need for a Palestinian state. But that puts himself in a situation where he can spin the Americans along that path. The Americans pay lip service. The American governments have paid lip service to a 2-state solution, but they do nothing to enforce it. Very little. But Iran has taken full advantage in the region by playing the Palestinian card. They have regional ambitions, and they see this issue festering, which is not being addressed. So they take advantage of it. And that, I think, is why the Netanyahu government had Iran in the crosshairs. Because while Iran was, if you like, quite active regionally, and its allies like the Houthis and Hezbollah, they're the ones who tried to react to the Mr. Netanyahu's mighty vengeance campaign, as he called it, in Gaza. So I do think the geopolitical angle is very important. It'll be interesting to see, now that attention is back on Gaza, it's an absolutely appalling situation there at the moment, as you mentioned, Peter, with 50 or even more people being killed a day. There used to be 300. When UNRWA were involved, there used to be 300 areas where people could collect food. There are now 4.
Yeah.
So this is leading to really appalling scenes where people are literally clambering over each other to get food and getting, unfortunately, killed in the process sometimes. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose my point here is that this issue of the two-state solution, it would be good if even if the United States feels paralyzed about it, it would be good if the other liberal democracies did not take a backward step on that issue, and New Zealand shouldn't either.
Let me just ask the three of you one quick question, and we'll go round. I wonder whether we do need to, despite the Mark Rutte blowjob of Trump, which he obviously worked. I mean, that hideous note worked. But do we not, in fact, have to give Donald Trump some credit for imposing a ceasefire the way he did and being bold enough to do it? And is he the kind of person who can be bold when other people would be diplomatic and polite and so on? And I'm thinking about Gaza and Palestine and that. Jonathan?
Which
You've
doesn't happen very often.
Please go ahead.
I said I'm temporarily speechless, but it doesn't happen too often. It's hard to say. I mean, as Robert and our other guests on previous shows have said, it's hard to see that he has a plan at any one moment. So I just don't know. I guess I don't feel qualified to really address that. But I think that from a logical sort of newsreader standpoint, no, he's not Nixon to China, not at this stage.
Excellent comparison. Thank you, Tricia.
No, I'm not going to give Donald Trump any credit for anything. He doesn't have a plan. It's random. It changes from day to day. And I live in hope that I'll turn on my news one morning and that somehow within the US constitutional system, they'll muzzle him.
Robert, do you write a column this week praising Trump?
No, for reasons very similar to Teresa. I think I would have been, Mr. Trump said he was going to bring, as well as bringing peace to Gaza in 24 hours when he was on the campaign trail, he also pledged to bring peace quickly to Gaza. In fact, he went to some key states in the US and promised that to Arab Americans. And he hasn't delivered. He can't. It seems to me US presidents have a problem dealing with Netanyahu and maybe Israel governments in general. They seem to be incapable of standing up to them. America's interests are not identical to Israel's. America is a global superpower. It's the most powerful country in the world. But it seems to have a very partisan approach, and it largely seems to be the tail wagging the dog in terms of the US-Israeli relations.
Which is very much the John Mearsheimer view from some years ago. Now, JCPOA, the Obama agreement with many other countries, the extraordinary diplomatic work and negotiation work that went into that, Tricia, that doesn't seem so bad in the end, does it? Now that it's gone, because
of diplomacy at the time. It was an absolute triumph, and without kind of sending everybody to sleep, it basically went like this. It was sort of like a plurilateral agreement because there had been a dispute going on under the NPT, auspices of the NPT for a long time, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action allowed states to step outside and do a deal where across several years, sanctions would be progressively lifted against Iran. That was what Iran got out of it. In return for that, there was a stepped up, even more super verification provisions by the IAEA. And Iran promised to reduce, the centrifuges and so on and so forth. So it was a long-term strategy, and it was working until it was working in that sanctions were lifted, things were going, well on that front. The IAEA inspectors were reporting that Iran was complying with these super stringent things. And might I add in here that Israel is not a party to the NPT, so does not have any inspections.
Yes.
But that was working all really well until Donald Trump came in the first.
Blew up JCPOA, and now he says he's not even sure they want to have inspections because it's all been obliterated. I mean, Jonathan, you brought this up which was the idea that having done this, or having had this happened, what is the incentive in a sense for Iran to rejoin the IAEA or the NPT?
Well, as I said at the outset,
the non-proliferation treaty. I'm sorry.
Yeah, as I said at the outset, for now at least, they benefit from the ambiguity. And so the IAEA inspectors could perhaps most likely give a third party independent view of the state of the nuclear arms industry. So we're not going to know. I don't know that they're going to keep them out. Parliament has voted, but the Guardian Council, the superior jurisprudence will have to decide if that's really what they want. And Khamenei will obviously have the last say, or his replacement if he's no longer with us. But I could see them rejoining. I could see them rejoining, sure.
So unless I missed
Tricia?
some news today, and maybe I don't have very good sound at all, Iran hasn't withdrawn from the NPT.
No, they have not.
No, not
Parliament
yet, no.
voted to say they didn't want the IAEA to come back.
Okay.
So
they're going
it's
to
ambiguous.
They're going to breach their verification obligations.
But that's Parliament, as I explained. That's only a preliminary. And things in Iran have a lot of moving parts. Something when I was a correspondent there, I learned to my chagrin. It took a while to learn that. Okay. You have to really wait and see how things shake down. Yeah.
So, Jonathan, let me just ask you. You wanted to talk about terrorism as a word and as a concept, and it's perfect. You were worried that we wouldn't have time to discuss it, or it wouldn't be relevant, but I think it is relevant in the area that you want, and we've got two terrific people to give you a little bit of thought back on it. What is it you
gave me the great opening accidentally with this twice mention of death cult, which I'm going to have to jump up and down about.
Good.
Where does that come from? Well, I'll tell you where that comes from. That comes from this notion that is within this anti-Islam discourse and the discourse of violence, and perpetuated most powerfully probably by our friend Thomas Friedman, that violence by Muslim-affiliated groups, and we can take Al-Qaeda as a specific example, is for its own sake. That there's a psychopathology here, that they're killing people because they can and because they hate. And how does Friedman structure this? And by the way, I've written an entire chapter of a book about this, so I have a great amount of detail on my hand. I won't go down in the weeds too far. How does Friedman and his supporters justify this? They say, well, there were no demands when Al-Qaeda struck the towers in New York and later the Pentagon in Washington. It was just violence for violence's sake, which fits in the discourse that I spoke about last week, which sees Islam as inherently violent and a religion of the sword. The problem is, of course, that there were demands, and they're well known and they're published. You can get them on the internet. They've been translated into every language you can think of, and they're very specific. And what do they want? They want the Crusader forces, i.e. the Americans, out of the Middle East. Now, that doesn't mean the Americans have to leave, but it's what I guess where I'm coming from is terrorism, when we talk about it, has lost its meaning in the West. And George W. Bush was the most extreme example, because if you go to his speeches, he talks about the war on terror. To take the ism out of terrorism is a huge mistake and a misunderstanding of the phenomenon itself, and leads to a dead end, which is, I think, where we are now. Because the ism is the motivation for a group to do something abhorrent. Why they do it, is it worth it? These are different, that's a different discussion. But the action is not death for death's sake. It is in the furtherance of an ambition, of a program, of an idea. And if we take the ism out, what are we really doing? We're stepping back and depriving the opportunity to figure out what a resolution could be. Why is somebody doing this thing, this horrible thing? Why are they strapping on a belt and going into a pizzeria and pushing a button? Are they doing it just because they hate humanity? So I get worked up about it a bit because I think it really is a dead end, a very serious dead end that the West has led itself into by refusing to take the terrorists and terrorism seriously. And it absolves us of having to figure out maybe there's a Western role in some of this. Maybe there's a policy that needs to be re-examined. But if it's just death for death's sake, then of course, what can we do? We just have to blow them all up.
Tricia, I imagine you have quite a strong perspective on this, or an interested, because I sent Jonathan your statement from that organisation this week and that one about demonisation. Do you have a response to what Jonathan just said? And I am going to wind up the show shortly.
I do, and we've run into tricky problems because when we try to understand why people go into a crowded marketplace and blow everybody up, including themselves, I mean, when I see that happening, I'm just completely overwhelmed with sadness that their lives got to that. And when you read novels where it tries to get into the head of people and communities like that, and you can hear from my accent, I'm Irish, right?
Exactly.
So we're familiar with notions of terrorism. And I'm just sad that they can't see a way forward. But you have to be very careful where you say that, and here I am on a podcast, because you're immediately painted as an apologist for that level.
Yes, and what you've done so well this week and the last time you came in was deal with it from a point of view of law and intellect, as you have, Jonathan. Robert, would you like to comment on this terrorism question and how we see it and how we label people?
Yeah, well, I think, coming back to Jonathan's point, I think there's been a self-serving use of this term. The idea, since 9/11, America has been fixated largely, until the Biden administration, with Islamist terrorism. But in fact, more Americans have been killed by white supremacist extreme violence since 9/11 than have been by Islamist terrorism. And the other thing is that this label terrorism, which is often reserved for, Iran, in Mr. Trump's justification for the bunker bombs being dropped, he said Iran is the greatest sponsor of terrorism around the world. But from Palestinians' point of view, and from many people in the Middle East, they would say there's other actors involved in the region committing acts, war crimes, and using violence in a way which is completely inconsistent with a rules-based order. So, it's self-serving. It's also, and I think I really agree with what Jonathan said, it's also putting up a smokescreen and preventing issues which need to be tackled. Issues like the Palestinian right to political self-determination. Mr. Netanyahu constantly talks about winning the war against terrorists in Gaza. But most Palestinians in Gaza don't particularly like Hamas, and Hamas actually developed in the course of presenting themselves as an effective resistance to Israeli occupation. Yeah. I'm not saying they are, and they do engage in terrorism, but I'm just saying I do think, I think this is Jonathan's real key point, that it takes our eyes off the ball. It means that we are not dealing with issues which may resolve issues which are apparently intractable.
And let me say, I think the media is incredibly important in this, and it's very hard to give this perspective. And this is exactly why I was so keen to bring Jonathan in this, because he's made me really think about the ephemerality of the way that we often report on these. I'm being told by the audience, Tricia, that I may have cut you off when you had a sentence still to talk about perhaps your Northern Ireland, or your Irish background rather on this. I thought you had finished your sentence, and I wouldn't dream of cutting you off if I could possibly avoid it. Pardon me? I'm what?
I said they're quite hard on you.
They are quite hard on me, and also there's a couple of people there who, one new person, and another person who often speaks for the Israeli perspective on this, or the current Israeli perspective on it. And I dislike seeing parts of our audience pile onto them. I have invited one of these people who I think has been having a go at Robert and me for some years now to contact me directly. But the pile on is not what this show is about. Thank you all very much. I did want to go even further, but Simon, our lovely producer, Simon Josie, is commanding that I finish. Jonathan, I hope you got some feedback, interest on your terrorism point that you wanted to make.
Well, I want to thank Robert for putting it much better than I could have put it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. We're all in love with you. So I'm just going to do a quick skateboarding, or you stay on while I do the quick skateboarding dog, if you like, because I was really struck by we basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing, that Trump said today. I actually really liked that. People know that I sometimes use words like this, and I was reminded of his shithole countries remark. Then I looked up today, Kevin Rudd, the Australian Prime Minister, described China as rat fucking. Vicente Fox said, I'm not going to pay for that fucking wall. Joe Biden on Obamacare said, this is a big fucking deal. And Obama once called Mitt Romney a bullshitter. But then I went back to Michael Wolff's book, and we had Michael on a few months ago, and Rupert Murdoch, quoted in Fire and Fury, says of Trump, what a fucking idiot. And then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says, what a fucking moron. And that's how long they lasted. Anyway,
I'm glad that you didn't use any New Zealand examples.
Well, funny enough, somebody's asked me to write a story about that. We had the C word used in Parliament recently, Jonathan, and yesterday a veteran politician described somebody else in Parliament as a dickhead, and then went outside and apologised. But then he went outside and said, "Is it really bad language?" So, thank you and good night, everybody, and good luck, as George Clooney might say. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you, Peter.
And thanks to the audience.
Bye.